Hey, everybody. Good afternoon. We got a lot going on this afternoon. We have it. I'm Yasmin Vasugian here, in for Chris Chansing at MSNBC headquarters in New York, and we're coming on the air with that breaking news. We have the affidavit the DOJ used to request a search of the former president's Florida compound. We're all reading through it in real time. It has a heck of a lot of redactions. Almost half of the 38 or so pages is, in fact, redacted, but also having some major new information, including information about what the FBI found in an initial search of those 15 boxes of documents former President Trump's team turned over to the National Archives. In those boxes, they found 184 unique documents bearing classification markings, including 67 documents marked as confidential, 92 as secret, 25 as top secret. Also going into detail about the specific areas of Mar-a-Lago that are not authorized locations for the storage of classified information, mentioning 3 areas called former President Trump's residential suite, an area that is called Pine Hill, and an area called the 45 office. We also have the document written by the Justice Department to justify those redactions. Also a lot of information in there mentioning threats of violence made towards FBI agents and more. We have a team going through all of it as we speak. We're trying to disseminate it, and we're going to bring it all to you. And that team is joining me now. Want to bring in Ken Delanian, Ryan Riley, Shaq Brewster, all with NBC. Also with us, Frank Figluzzi, former assistant director for counterintelligence at the FBI and an NBC News national security analyst. Charles Coleman, a former prosecutor and an NBC News legal analyst as well. Welcome to you all, guys. So we've been spending the last 30 minutes or so, it seems, kind of sifting through all of these documents, trying to disseminate kind of the justification, right, for this search warrant and the communication that was had between the National Archives, the Department of Justice, along with the Trump team. And there's a heck of a lot of really interesting stuff and kind of mind-blowing stuff in all of it. Ryan, let me just start with you on this one and kind of ask you what stands out to you so far in this affidavit.
You know, there's a lot notable about this. One thing I really wanted to highlight here, just because I think it's remarkable considering the source. So Donald Trump's lawyer back in May wrote this letter to the Justice Department, essentially accusing them of getting politics involved in this investigation. You know, I would remind you of the fact that this all stays secret. DOJ didn't speak about this for months, even though there was this ongoing dialogue, and you know, the former president had stored all of these records down at Mar-a-Lago that he wasn't supposed to have. But I want to read you this quote because it's from Evan Corcoran saying that we request that DOJ adhere to longstanding policies and procedures regarding communications between DOJ and the White House regarding pending investigative matters, which are designed to prevent political interference in DOJ decision making. Just to highlight that and underscore it, that's Donald Trump's lawyer saying that there should be a wall between the Justice Department and the White House. You know, he had some issues with that during his own administration. It's sort of remarkable that he would make that point explicitly and say, oh, make sure there's no interference between with the DOJ decision-making process by the White House. And of course, we haven't seen any indications of that coming from the Biden administration, which has been very hands-off of this investigation.
So somewhat ironic, to say the least. Ken Delanian, let's talk the contents of some of this affidavit, which I find fascinating. The classification of some of the documents that were contained, that they believe were contained, being stored at Mar-a-Lago, the high classification of them, really, and who they could feasibly compromise.
Yeah, Yasmin, that's what really jumped out to me as somebody who's covered the intelligence community for a lot of years. These kinds of markings are not seen on documents that are found outside of special facilities designed to house classified documents, period, end of story. I mean, human control system was one of the markings they found on documents. That connotes basically a CIA field report, a report by a CIA officer, perhaps maybe a Defense Intelligence Agency officer, but normally CIA, about his or her debriefing of a confidential source overseas, a spy. Now, normally those reports don't leave the CIA, but in some cases, I'm told, when senior intelligence officials are briefing the president on a significant intelligence development, they may want to show the president exactly where it came from and the direct source information. This is raw intelligence. This is not finished intelligence written up by analysts. This is right from the collector. And so if that's what happened here and he took it home with him and it ended up in Mar-a-Lago, that is just absolutely stunning.
Ken, let me step in for one moment, because I do want folks to understand what you're talking about, right? This human control system, or HCS as it's classified, it's designed to protect intelligence information derived from clandestine human sources, commonly referred to, and this is, by the way, I'm reading from the affidavit here, as human intelligence. The HCS control system protects human intelligence-derived information relating to human intelligence activities, capabilities, techniques, processes, and procedures. I mean, you don't have to watch Homeland to know how incredibly important something like this is and how important it is to protect these sources overseas, their safety, especially considering the position they're putting themselves in.
Right. So in English, what you just read there means it's generally a report from a CIA officer about his or her conversations and debriefings of a spy. Super sensitive stuff. It may not have the name of the source, but it may have identifying information. Not the kind of stuff that ever gets outside a vault, essentially. And the other really alarming designation is SI, for signals intelligence, which means NSA, it could mean National Security Agency, intercepts of foreign leader communications or other kinds of phone calls, emails. The NSA is vacuuming stuff up all over the world. It's super highly classified. It makes up, in many cases, 3/4 of the president's daily intelligence brief, because they're getting a lot of really good stuff. But that is very, very secret stuff. And if the idea that documents with those markings were in Mar-a-Lago, again, just alarming. And there's, other markings, no foreign, means intelligence so sensitive it can't be shared with any foreign nationals, including our closest allies, the Brits and the Australians. And ORCON, meaning originator control, which is just means that the agency that has the document decides who sees it. So it's just another evidence of how highly classified these documents are. And the last thing I want to say, Yasmin, is in the memorandum of law, separate from the affidavit that they filed, we also learned something important, which is that the Justice Department said that there are a significant number of civilian witnesses whose identities they need to protect. So the idea that there was one informant, one confidential human source that gave them the roadmap to this whole thing is belied by this language. There are a lot of people talking to the FBI.
By the way, Ken, that's not the last thing you're going to stay. You're sticking around as you guys are sifting through these documents, because we have a lot to get through with that. But Shaq, I want to come to you down at Mar-a-Lago, because I know the former president now is responding to the release of this now redacted copy of this affidavit.
That's exactly right. We've seen 3 individual posts from the former president. 2 of them were audio posts, 1 an actual statement from the former president. And, it's mirroring what we've heard from him before. In direct response to the affidavit, he's saying that it's heavily redacted. That was the first comment that he made. He said nothing mentioned on nuclear. We know that some of the early reports after the initial August 8th search said that some of the documents received were connected to nuclear weapons. He's saying there that nothing in the affidavit is mentioned on nuclear. And then he went on to attack the judge in this case. The judge that was presented with this affidavit decided that there was enough probable cause to have that search at the FBI facility, or excuse me, at Mar-a-Lago, based on the FBI affidavit there. But, in the audio feed, in the audio recording that the former president posted, one thing that he also said, and I'm looking at my notes here, he said they could have talked to us. They could have taken anything they needed. And one thing that we learned from the affidavit is that there were exchanges between the FBI and members of the DOJ and the former president's team there. So some things that the president's saying in these comments, in these audio comments, are already disputed by what he's actually attacking right now.
Let me read for you one letter from DOJ counsel to the former president's counsel in talking to him about these records that were stored at Mar-a-Lago. As I previously indicated to you, this is page 22 of this affidavit. Paragraph 61, as I previously indicated to you, Mar-a-Lago does not include a secure location authorized for the storage of classified information. As such, it appears that since the time classified documents, and then this area is redacted, were removed from the secure facilities, the White House, and moved to Mar-a-Lago on or around January 20th, 2021, They have not been handled in an appropriate manner or stored in an appropriate location. Accordingly, we ask that the room at Mar-a-Lago where the documents had been stored be secured, and that all the boxes that were moved from the White House to Mar-a-Lago, along with any other items in that room, be preserved in that room in their current condition until further notice. And by the way, that is not the only documentation of the correspondence they had with the Trump team throughout this affidavit. Frank Figluzzi, let me go to you on this one, because also standing out to me, of course, is this letter attached that we have right here to this affidavit written by Trump's attorneys to the Department of Justice.
Yeah, look, I want to piggyback on something Ken referenced, which is there are witnesses in this case. Clearly, when we see in this release document that there is probable cause to believe that evidence of obstruction is in Mar-a-Lago, and they'll find evidence of obstruction if they're permitted to search Mar-a-Lago. Somehow they believe that something's been altered, destroyed, and they need to get in there and find that evidence. And then secondly, probable cause to believe that national defense information is still at Mar-a-Lago is what they're telling the judge to justify their search. Again, there's likely people saying, yeah, not only is there still classified, but there's NDI here. So people understand national defense information is a subset of classified information. It doesn't apply to all classified information. And look, as someone who spent 25 years at the FBI, eventually heading counterintelligence, holding the various compartmented clearances that are referenced in this affidavit, I can tell you that the hair on the back of my neck stood up when I saw those classification markings referenced here. The HCS clearance, that's something that's not automatic. I had to actually be approved for an H clearance, as we refer to it. It is human spies, and it could be very singular in nature. You know, you look at a document, you read it, you hear a conversation recounted about what a foreign leader said on a Tuesday at 3 p.m. There's only one other person in that room. That would mean that that person is working for the U.S. government. People die because of that decision to work for the U.S. government. The same goes for SIGINT. A microphone placed in someone's office abroad could be gone forever. And my question as a counterintelligence professional is whether the FBI, upon seeing some of this material, shared it immediately with NSA or CIA and said perhaps to CIA, you need to think about exfiltrating this human source of yours before he gets killed. Yeah. That's how serious this is.
Because if you think about, Frank, that compound, and I do want to get into that letter that I mentioned as I came to you, but if you think about that compound, right, let's bring up the images of Mar-a-Lago that we were just showing, guys, as I talked to Frank here. It's not a secure location. I mean, it's stated here in this affidavit, right? And when you have human intelligence sources that are so incredibly vulnerable, and also, by the way, helpful to the advancement of the interests and motivations of the United States, not under lock and key in an unsecure location. What does that say, by the way, to the trust the United States has overseas in recruiting others to work for them?
You know, we've had similar discussions over the years about the erosion of trust and credibility amongst our allies, and the harm done for the ability to recruit someone and say, come work for Team America, right? Sit across the desk, ask someone to betray their country for you, maybe even leave their family to work for America. And they look at you and say, wait a minute, this guy, this president, now former president, is storing our documents. How can I trust what you're going to do with the information I provide you? It hurts. It hurts our ability and the mission.
Talk to me about this letter, Frank. I know you have some interest in it. It's fascinating to kind of read through, of course, the thinking of the Trump team and how they address the Department of Justice in considering possible investigation with these documents being stored at Mar-a-Lago.
Well, first, there's a general tenor throughout this that says, look, we think this is politically motivated. We're willing to give you what you want. And then it's disingenuous, Yasmin. It's buying time. We need more time. We think you're being controlled by the White House. And really poor legal posturing and reasoning here. there's a disingenuous nature to the whole letter, to the fact that I see a buying of time here. I see the motions they filed in general, saying, yeah, we need to string this out. Can we have more time? And then I see an over-deference. I have to be very honest with you. You know, people on the far right are criticizing the government for, quote unquote, moving too fast to a search warrant. I'm criticizing the government for not moving fast enough. When we see the chronology of events here, there was too much deference paid to the Trump team and Trump himself.
Ken, want to go back to you on this one, because I know you're getting some new information about nuclear threats, I believe, I'm being told. Talk to me.
Well, I just wanted to make the point, Yasmin, the president is raising questions about, well, there was a report that they were looking for nuclear information, and we don't see evidence of that in this document. They would never put something like that, so highly top secret, in a document like this. In fact, and the evidence we have for the fact that they withheld certain things is that in the letter that the National Archives posted on its website a few days ago, there was reference to in those 15 boxes in January, markings including SAP, Special Access Program, which designates a highly classified program that only a small number of people in the government are read into. There's no reference to that in here either, and there's a reason for that, because that's too sensitive to put in a document like this. There's a lot about these documents that is not in here, and including no description of the nature of them, of why they're classified, just the markings, because the FBI needs to describe the markings to explain to the judge how serious they are, but nothing about the contents. Yasmin.
Charles Coleman, let's bring you into the conversation here, because much of the balance, right, that the Attorney General needed to strike in issuing these redactions was justifying the search warrant right, but maintaining the integrity of this early and ongoing investigation.
Right. I think it's important to put in context what we're actually seeing. Usually when affidavits are released to the public, which is not abnormal, it doesn't come until after charges have been filed. And in this case, you're seeing the affidavit take place, or the affidavit be unsealed, essentially, during the course of an investigation. And so while there have been a lot of calls from the public and from media and from different sides around getting this information out, I understand it's interesting, it's salacious, and people want to see what the details are. Yeah. There are literally no winners from either side. If you're someone who believes in justice and believes that, Donald Trump needs to be not only investigated, but also indicted and prosecuted for the things he's done wrong, you need to wait and be patient, because releasing these details and this information early on can only compromise Merrick Garland's investigation and make his job that much more difficult. Obviously, if you're Donald Trump, you may be yelling that you want transparency, but you really don't, because if those details come out, they're only going to box you in from a defense place, and they're only going to make it harder for you to assert what it is you've been trying to claim, which is, oh, this caught me by surprise, I turned everything over previously. All of those things have now been debunked. So in truth, the more that comes out, at least earlier on, it actually makes it harder for everyone involved, and it's not a good thing. That's why you see Merrick Garland and the DOJ take such a very fine-tuned approach in terms of what it is that they actually did let out in the interest of justice, following the judge's orders with respect to their redactions and this affidavit and search warrant.
Ryan Riley, what do you make of this? In speaking of the contents of the initial boxes that were turned over to the National Archives and what was in them, this affidavit reads this: newspapers, magazines, printed news articles, photos, miscellaneous printouts, notes, presidential correspondence, personal and post-presidential records, and a lot of classified records. Of most significant concern was that highly classified records were unfolded, intermixed with other records, and otherwise improperly identified.
That's right, and there's also a note about there how some of the former president's own handwriting had been on some of those documents, which would, of course, make them presidential documents. I mean, it shows that the former president is somewhat of a pack rat, and we've heard that described in NBC News' own reporting about these sort of last-minute hurdles that were happening with them trying to get all these documents together, things being sort of haphazard and thrown all together. But there also is a line in here regarding when it cites a January 18th, 2021 CBS Miami news article, which says that moving trucks were spotted at Mar-a-Lago. And that's just, that's before the actual presidency, the transfer of power took place, right? So even though we know about the sort of haphazard idea of things being moved very quickly, there were already these moving trucks at Mar-a-Lago before Donald Trump's presidency actually ended. That's in a very heavily redacted portion of this affidavit, so we don't know what the context of is that all around there. But I think that the timeline is also somewhat important here, even though we should always keep our eyes on the big picture here. Is that Donald Trump was not supposed to have any presidential records stored back at Mar-a-Lago. He's supposed to have those stored by the National Archives. They would have eventually been at the Donald Trump Presidential Library whenever that came about. But in the meantime, those are government documents that belong to the government. There's obviously going to be, for generations, we'll be studying the Trump presidency. So all the documents are very key to understanding exactly what was happening in the White House during the Trump presidency, Yasmin.
So this question is either going to go to Ken or Frank. Not necessarily sure who knows the answer to it. Is there ever an incident in which a president, an outgoing president, right, in leaving the White House with his stuff, right, you're moving out of your house, you got your boxes, you got the moving people there, that the contents of what you are removing from the White House is searched to make sure there's no classified material inside of it? To either one of you, Frank, do you know the answer to that?
So the short answer is no, I'm not aware of any search, but here's why. There's a separation of documents and of duties. So you have the residential staff and you have the office staff, the Oval Office, and the document experts whose job it is every day to retain government records. So the problem here is Trump mixed those two places, and he would routinely, reportedly, take classified up into the residence. And we even know from reporting that Pat Cipollone had communicated to the archives, yeah, right, the stuff in the residence needs to go. He's got classified there. So it's this mixture that has really caused the problem and maybe precluded professionals from doing what was right, or at least precluded Trump from doing what was right. But it seems to me he squirreled this away in the residence intentionally.
Guys, if you could stand by, I want to bring in now NBC News chief Washington correspondent and host of MSNBC's Andrew Mitchell Reports, who was on the air when all of this broke and did a superb job of breaking it for everybody and explaining exactly how important it was as to what we're reading in this whole thing. Andrea, I mean, it's astounding, as Ken and I were talking about, specifically the classification of some of the material that was found or that is believed to be stored at Mar-a-Lago, and the reason for which they felt as if it needed to be returned to the archives. Talk about that.
What's so astounding about this is that this was in the initial 15 boxes back in January that were finally turned over to the archives, not even what was found in this search. So we know that even in that initial 15 boxes to the archives last January, there were documents marked human intelligence. These are human beings. These are spies that it takes years to embed in foreign governments, at sometimes at the highest levels, and could be compromised by the disclosure, by the careless way that they were stored at Mar-a-Lago, or something more overt, by something involving, trading secrets. I mean, we don't know what is involved actually, and what will eventually, if it is charged, what could be charged. But just the whole casual nature of this alone is so remarkable. There were, defense information, national defense information documents. There were documents involving, SI, that's signals intelligence. That's our secret methods. We don't want the bad guys to know how, sophisticated our intelligence, our electronic intelligence gathering is, so that if they think they're talking on a secure phone, they're really not, that we can overhear a foreign leader saying something to his defense minister, let's say. You're in a war context, you're terrorists. I mean, just the very fact that signals intelligence is exposed or is made vulnerable is enough reason to justify, in most cases, getting a search warrant right away. But in this case, this was already back in January, going to their lawyers and asking the Trump lawyers, and then, of course, eventually a subpoena, the visit in June at very high levels. The top intelligence expert in the National Security Division going, and also, of course, a senior U.S. attorney. And then, of course, the search warrant when it became very clear to them, and these are redactions, but clear to them that witnesses would be vulnerable if this were all released. But this was the affidavit that gave the judge the reason to cite probable cause of at least 3 possible potential crimes. Now, this is probable cause. It does not mean that this is beyond a reasonable doubt. It's just probable cause to justify a search warrant, which really does debunk, to any careful reader or anyone listening to these facts, debunk all of the claims of, full cooperation. And what I have printed out in large enough for all of us to read very clearly is what the former president said on social media. Heavily redacted, nothing mentioned on nuclear. Well, they mentioned national defense information, so we don't know what that is. A total public relations subterfuge by the FBI and DOJ, or a close working relationship regarding document turnover. We gave them much, et cetera. And it talks about hatred and animosity. And the fact is, this affidavit as released and the unredacted portions, and certainly what we can infer from the run-up to the redacted portions, there was plenty of opportunity. There was more than a year since he left office, and lots of attempts to get real cooperation, and also specific language saying that if this were released in a fully unredacted form, it would compromise or intimidate witnesses, multiple witnesses. So it tells you that this investigation has a lot of witnesses and a lot of people, and that there is evidence that they say is in the redacted portions, that there has also been plenty of reason to believe that they have already seen witness intimidation attempts, obstruction.
Ooh, a lot to get through and take in as we continue to sift through this affidavit. As always, my friend Andrea Mitchell, thank you. Our thanks as well to Ken, Ryan, Frank, and Charles. We're going to continue our rolling coverage, everybody, of this affidavit release. Stay with us. You are watching MSNBC. Welcome back, everybody. It's the bottom of the hour, around 1:31. We are about 60 minutes since this affidavit was released, the redacted copy of the search warrant affidavit for Mar-a-Lago. We have it in our hands. It's about 38 pages or so, and there's a heck of a lot in it, half of which is basically redacted. There is the classification of the documents found at Mar-a-Lago, some of which are astounding, that we are going to be talking about. The correspondence, of course, between the National Archives, the Department of Justice, along with the former president's team. And then there is the justification for the search warrant that was issued back in early August. We're going to get to all of that with my team. Want to bring in NBC senior White House correspondent Kelly O'Donnell, former federal prosecutor Shan Wu, MSNBC contributor and former U.S. attorney and senior FBI official Chuck Rosenberg, and back with me is Charles Coleman as well. Kelly, let me just start with you, of course, because you're outside the White House there, and a lot of folks wondering how the White House is responding, if they're sifting through it themselves, the president as well, if he has anything to say.
Well, the White House, meaning the current Biden White House, and we want to, when we refer to the former president, I'm sure that gets confusing to viewers at sometimes, but President Biden has said that he is not involved in this. This is a matter for the Justice Department. Earlier in the week, he had said that he had had no advance warning that there would be a search at Mar-a-Lago. And today, when asked by one of our colleagues, a reporter in the pool, at an event for President Biden that was unrelated to any of this, at the end of the event, as we often do when we try to ask a question about the news of the day, the president was asked, do you believe there is any compromise to national security based on what has happened at Mar-a-Lago? And President Biden said, we'll let the Department of Justice determine that, and we'll see what happens. So that kind of question, which is one that has been raised by lawmakers. We've seen the Senate Intelligence Committee, which is evenly divided, Republicans and Democrats. Most committees are not split as evenly, but Intelligence always is. They have said that they want to have a review of a damage assessment, if you will, of materials that were at Mar-a-Lago, either those surrendered earlier in the process or those seized during the execution of the search warrant, and what was the possible risk to national security. Those questions have been asked by lawmakers. The Department of Justice has indicated that this is an active investigation, and typically that needs to operate in its own sphere and not have oversight while the investigation is going on. Clearly, the members of Congress have some oversight over what happens at the Department of Justice. So there's a lot of distancing that's happening in the Biden administration from the Department of Justice. There was a question you asked just a short time before the break about does anybody look in the boxes?
Yeah.
And so the General Services Administration is responsible for the transport of goods from a president who is leaving office to their home. What is interesting is they are simply putting together the truck and the order to ship it. It is the outgoing transition team that is required to do the packing of the boxes, the organizing of pallets, and to sign for those contents. And so the outgoing transition team, so people who are working for, in this case, Trump, would have signed that those goods that were being packed were necessary for the office of the former president or his personal belongings. And so that's how they determined that. The presumption is that you're not taking government records you're not entitled to.
Yeah.
And so there isn't a looking in each of the boxes based on the reporting I've been doing on this. But that is how it's done. And as you know, it's done on January 20th in a very hasty way with packing done in the days leading up to it. And for this particular former president, it was a particularly hasty circumstance because he didn't want to leave office and didn't think he would have to, not like the end of a two-term presidency when there's a lot of buildup and packing that goes on for a much longer period of time.
A lot of good information there, Kellyo. We thank you for filling us in on that. Actually, I want to pick up on one thing that Kelly just brought up. Chuck, if you could fill us in a little bit on the damage assessment. I know that hasn't yet been launched. Some of the conversations that we've been having on air with folks that know a bit about when a damage assessment is actually launched, there could be some sort of informal damage assessment happening as they're going through, sifting through some of the documents that they seized from Mar-a-Lago. But what is the justification for holding off on that?
Well, first, just take the notion of a damage assessment, Yasmin, outside of this political vortex. When we have highly classified information and we worry that it's been compromised in some way, intentionally, unintentionally, willfully, negligently, whatever it may be, it's incumbent on the intelligence community to try and figure out if any damage has been done. If damage has been done, what do we need to do to protect our sources and our methods and our assets? So this is, I don't want to say it's a routine thing because fortunately we don't have routine compromises of highly classified information. But when we do, or when we fear it, then we do a damage assessment. And so, look, I assume that this is just something that is reflexively done within the intelligence community. I've seen the results of these types of assessments when I was a federal prosecutor and when I was at the FBI. It's something that we take very seriously because we spend a lot of human capital and money in order to stand up these intelligence systems, signals intelligence, human intelligence, all sorts of ways in which we collect information to help protect the national security of the United States. So I assume it's being done. It is done when we believe there's been a compromise, and we have to think of it not as Republicans or Democrats or left or right, but outside of the political vortex as something we need to do to protect the national security interests of the United States.
All right, so here's what we're going to do, guys, with the three brilliant legal minds that I have on this panel. I first want to kind of talk about what is standing out to you amongst these 38 pages, a bit tongue-tied there. And then we're going to address what happens next. Right? A lot of folks watching this and saying, okay, what is going to come of all of this? So Chuck, let me just start with you and ask you that very question. What stood out to you?
Well, I was actually more interested in the memorandum that the government filed with the redacted affidavit than in the affidavit itself, because I wasn't terribly surprised that we didn't get the good stuff. And the stuff we did get, the procedural history, in many ways was largely known. So I would commend to your viewers, Yasmin, that they take a look at the memo that was filed with the affidavit, because it explains the rationale for why you keep this stuff under seal. You don't want witnesses to be threatened or retaliated against. You want to protect the safety of law enforcement officers. And we saw what happened in the FBI field office in Ohio. You want to abide the law, and Rule 6E of the Federal Rules of Criminal Procedure require that grand jury information and information derived from grand jury investigations be kept secret. You don't want to give a roadmap to people who might obstruct the investigation. And last but not least, you want to protect the privacy interests of individuals who may be mentioned in an affidavit but haven't done anything wrong. And so it's a very cogent, very thoughtful explanation by the government of why the most important part of this affidavit, the probable cause basis, remains redacted. Read it. It makes sense.
So let me read a part of it, Chuck, for folks, especially the part that you were just referring to, because I do think it's incredibly important. Talking about possible witness intimidation. Some information falls within more than one category. The categories described are information from a broad range of civilian witnesses who may be subject to witness intimidation or retaliation, information regarding investigative avenues and techniques that could provide a roadmap for potential ways to obstruct the investigation, information whose disclosure is prohibited under Rule 6E, which Chuck just mentioned, such as grand jury subpoenas, testimony, and related material. And then information whose disclosure could risk the safety of law enforcement personnel, which we have already seen after the search took place, and information whose disclosure could harm legitimate privacy interests of third parties. Shan-Wu, let me bring you into the conversation here and ask you that same question. What stood out to you?
Yeah, I think what really stands out to me is that the Justice Department didn't move any more quickly than it did. I mean, looking at this with my cap on as a former federal prosecutor, former counsel to an attorney general, just reading between the lines, looking at the headings, it's really alarming. I mean, this information was scattered across the resort area with really no security for it whatsoever. There's a big blacked out section of probable cause to believe that there was still on the premises remaining national defense information, classified information, despite what had already been turned over and despite what had been told to them. So that really paints a very alarming picture. Even without those details, they understood that there was good reason to believe that they weren't being told the truth from the Trump representatives. And secondly, the thing that just jumped out at me was the exposure for the Trump lawyers. If you look at the letter, the representations that they're making, I would be concerned if I were them.
It's interesting that you bring up why it took the Justice Department for so long. And I want to kind of draw on that just a little bit, Shannon, because I'm wondering if you feel as if the reason why they waited was giving a former president the opportunity to abide by the law, right, and return the information, the boxes, the classified documents on their own, instead of seeming as if, because that's what we've been hearing a lot about from the Department of Justice over and over again, and even from the current president, President Biden, in not politicizing this process.
Oh, absolutely. I think that's exactly right. You know, I've been in meetings where people were thinking about the ramifications publicly of a criminal investigation, and these would have been really tough meetings. I mean, white knuckle time, worried about how it might look. And of course, the mission of Attorney General Garland was to restore the integrity of the Justice Department after it had been debased by the Barr Justice Department. Ironically, though, sometimes you have to move more quickly and be able to take action at the risk of looking political to make sure that you're really protecting the institution. So that's really the tough place that this DOJ found itself in.
Charles, do you think it will hinder this investigation that is currently developing into the former president and the classified documents that were being held at Mar-a-Lago because they waited so long or too long?
Ultimately, I don't. I think that this investigation is not going to be impeded by what we've seen in terms of the delay in time, if you can call it that. The DOJ has been lining up their witnesses and getting together the things that they need for this investigation for quite some time. And so I think every effort was made and has been made by Merrick Garland to ensure that he does not in any way, shape, or form reveal anything that is going to make more difficult the task of his attorneys, his U.S. attorneys that are working under under him, as well as the FBI who was working with him in this very historic and important investigation. But I did want to sort of point something out. I'm with Chuck in as much as I did not find a whole lot in the affidavit that I found to be incredibly striking, and that wasn't a surprise for me. But what I did find of interest, which was not contained in the affidavit, was the attached letter from Trump's attorneys to the DOJ. Right. And what I found interesting about that was this conversation where they lay out the notion of the president's ability to declassify documents, but they do not at any point state that the president actually declassified any particular documents. We all know as lawyers that if, in fact, you're going to play that card, you would then immediately follow it up by saying he has now declassified the certain XYZ documents and identified what those documents are. They didn't do that in that letter, which completely undercuts the defense that they've been trying to assert from the start and the outset of this entire incident with the search warrant, which was, oh, well, these were documents which were declassified. That completely undercuts that defense, and I found that to be very interesting.
So, Chuck Rosenberg, I think what everybody's asking now is, what's next? What is the Department of Justice doing? What happens now?
Well, they sort of told you what they're doing, Yasmin. They just haven't told you how they're doing it. They have an ongoing investigation, which is why large portions of the affidavit have been redacted. They have numerous witnesses that they are talking to and protecting, which is completely appropriate. Remember, search warrants come at the beginning of investigations, or sort of the early middle, and not typically at the very end. So we don't know precisely what they're doing or how they're doing it, nor are we entitled to know that, but we know they're still doing it. And I wanted to point out, I think Charles made a really interesting and important point by noting what's missing from the attorney's letter. But there's something else I would add to that. The three statutes that the government relied upon to get the search warrant don't require that the information that's mishandled or destroyed or be classified information at all. So we can debate, all day if you'd like, Yasmin, whether or not the president can or did declassify information on his way out the door. It doesn't appear that he did, but it also doesn't matter. And the statute that Mr. Trump's lawyer cited in the letter to the government is an entirely different statute. It's not the one they relied on to get the search warrant. So Charles points out a really interesting flaw in the letter, but there are more. And I think the more we read it, the more we'll find.
But also, and to your point, it doesn't really matter, but how would you declassify a document that contains such sensitive information as to make vulnerable human intelligence sources overseas?
Well, you really can't unless you go through. You really can't unless you go through a significant process with the agency that generated the information and that has the equities in it. So, for instance, the government would, even hypothetically, Yasmin, if the former president was able to declassify everything, which I don't believe he can do, I think is fanciful. But even hypothetically, if he could, disclosing that information could still do great harm to the national security interests of the United States. You'd still need to do a damage assessment. So let's not get hung up on whether or not it's classified, because the statutes on which the government relied to execute the warrant don't require it. And moreover, there doesn't seem, to Charles's point, to be any evidence that he actually declassified this stuff. But in the end, it doesn't matter.
Sham, one last one to you, and it's this idea of intent, right? As we have spoken about the former president over and over again, really, over the last 6 years, there is always this overarching question of, well, how do you prove his intent with whatever matter we're talking about, right? And I go back again to paragraph 24 in this affidavit, in which they refer to how this classified information was intermixed with newspapers and photos and personal notes. And I can imagine you got Trump attorneys and defense teams looking at that very paragraph and saying, well, he didn't know.
Well, I think to Chuck's point, he might theoretically be able to declassify information, but he can't transform national defense information into non-national defense information. And that's going to be a key part of the discussions in terms of what comes next at the Justice Department. There are going to be a lot of meetings where it is being discussed that exact point, which is what kind of intent here was there? Is there really a viable defense of innocuous or carelessness? That's what's really going to come next. This is going to be running up the chain. I'm sure Garland will be personally involved in this, as he already said he was, in terms of approving the warrant, as well as the Deputy Attorney General, Lisa Monaco. At the highest levels, they're going to have to really debate this question of intent and decide, is it there or not? Is it chargeable?
Shan, Chuck, Charles, thanks for talking with me, guys. As always, I appreciate you weighing in on this. Thank you. Want to bring in now from Capitol Hill, NBC senior national political reporter Sahil Kapoor and National Deputy Director of African American Outreach for former President Obama's 2008 campaign, Elena Beverly. Welcome to you both, guys. Thanks for joining us on this. Sahil, let me just start with you on this one and kind of hear if you're getting any reaction from the Hill today to this affidavit.
That's right, Yasmin. Just in the last few minutes, we have a statement from a prominent member of Congress, that is Senator Mark Warner, who is the Democratic chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, put out a measured statement in response to the release of this affidavit. I'll just read from it here. He says, it appears, based on the affidavit unsealed this morning, that among the improperly handled documents at Mar-a-Lago were some of our most sensitive intelligence. He went on to say that the Justice Department investigation must be allowed to proceed without interference. Now, Warner is in a position to have access to view highly sensitive and highly classified material pertaining to the United States. It's not entirely clear what he knows here, whether he knows more than what's public, but certainly he's in a position to. He noted that he and the vice chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee, Marco Rubio, a Republican, put out a bipartisan request to the Justice Department and to the Director of National Intelligence less than 2 weeks ago, after the Mar-a-Lago search was conducted, asking for a damage assessment of any national security threat posed by the mishandling of information. They also wanted to see what that information obtained was. Earlier this morning, I checked in with Warner's office, and they said they did not have updates to share. In other words, they do not appear to have gotten that assessment that they had requested from the Biden administration. And Warner, in this statement, re-upped that request for a damage assessment of potential risk to national security as a result of this alleged classified information being at Mar-a-Lago.
Yeah, I can only imagine the damage that has been done concerning the classification of some of the documents that were purported to be inside Mar-a-Lago. But there is more to come as we, of course, learn more about what, in fact, was taken during that search. Elena, let's talk first about kind of your reaction to what you've been reading.
Well, it's absolutely appalling, Yasmin. This is not a matter of just taking home some office supplies. These are documents that have grave implications for our national security. And allegedly, even if Donald Trump did not have malintent, this is still very disconcerting for our national security and for the American public. So it's something that we all need to be very concerned about, and also something that the Department of Justice needs to pursue and will pursue within the full force of the law. But I do think what we're going to see is the Biden administration actually distancing itself and not remarking and not making comments on this investigation. It is explosive enough without Biden getting involved in the fray, but they're turning their eyes toward the midterms and trying to make sure that this is not considered a political investigation, but just simply following the law and making sure that Americans stay protected.
Do you think that's a smart move for Democrats heading into the midterms, to keep separate this investigation from their political goals come the midterms?
I think it's absolutely imperative. And look, just last night, we heard from Biden a clear message about defending our country, defending democracy, and the contrast Democrats stand for in contrast to their opposition. They have a good story, a good legislative story to tell. Everything from the rescue plan to infrastructure to more recently the CHIPS Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, and now canceling student debt. They do not need to get into the fray that is Donald Trump. They simply need to stand for a very popular agenda and also share with the American public what could happen if there's a Republican majority that is elected both in the House and the Senate. There's enough on the Democrats' plate, there's enough on Biden's plate, and enough victories there to mobilize and galvanize voters without getting into the drama and the problem of Donald Trump.
So Sahil, while you've got, it seems, Democrats and the Biden administration kind of wanting to stay out of the fray, not wanting to politicize this ongoing investigation with the Department of Justice and the search, you have the former president and his team capitalizing on it.
That's right, Yasmin. We've seen former President Trump try to use this entire series of events to tighten his grip on the Republican Party, and there's some evidence that he has been successful at that within his party. Our latest NBC poll shows that, we asked this question about whether Republicans identify more with President Trump or more with the party as a whole in general. 41% in our recent poll said they identify more with Trump. 50% say they identify more with the Republican Party as a whole. But that Trump number, 41%, is up 7 points from earlier. Things were trending in the other direction, where there was some reason to believe, and many of Trump's critics were hoping, that his power over the Republican Party was fading a little bit. We're seeing the opposite happen in the wake of this Mar-a-Lago search, and we've seen Trump very successful in the past at trying to politicize these events. Anytime he's being investigated, whether it was the Mueller investigation, whether it was 2 impeachments, now we're seeing it happen here as well. For him to argue that he is being politically targeted by his opponents. Yeah. Now, there's no evidence for that. Let's be very clear. There's no evidence that the Biden administration is going after Trump politically. Attorney General Merrick Garland is an extremely by-the-book individual. The FBI director, Christopher Wray, is someone who was appointed by Donald Trump himself. There's nothing in his history that suggests he's using law enforcement for political ends here. But nevertheless, this is a narrative that Trump has run with, and a lot of his allies have run with it as well. Some of his potential rivals for the 2024 presidential nomination have also rushed to Trump's defense. So the remaining chapters have yet to be written, Yasmin, as to how this plays out politically. But so far, it seems like Trump has strengthened his grip on the Republican Party. Outside the Republican Party, however, it's a very different story. We saw independents break away from him in the 2020 election, and he's done very little to try to win those voters back.
And we're going to have to wait and see how it all plays out. Sahil Kapoor, Elena Beverly, thank you guys both. Appreciate it. That does it for us, everybody. Be sure to tune in to Chris Jansen Reports weekdays at 1:00 p.m. Eastern, right here on MSNBC. You can also catch me on weekends. That's tomorrow, by the way, on Yasmin Vasugian Reports, Saturdays and Sundays from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern, also on this network. Katie Tur picks up our coverage of breaking news on the Mar-a-Lago search affidavit next.